Welcome, everyone. Today we'll be discussing the topic of calories. When discussing nutrition, it is helpful to start with a discussion of calories. A calorie is a unit of energy. Energy is the currency that we use to pay for all processes of life, from the contraction of skeletal muscle, to the transport of ions through a channel, to the complex workings of the human brain. To study nutrition without understanding calories is like studying economics without understanding money. Specifically, the question that we want to answer is, how many calories should I eat? In order to understand that question, we need to have a deeper understanding of the relationship between calories, energy, and weight. Much of our perceptions and ideas about calories come from how we understand this relationship, specifically in terms of weight loss. We live in a world where everyone is concerned about losing weight, perhaps for a good reason. Rates of obesity in the U.S. are reaching epidemic proportions, with approximately 1 in 3 adults classified as obese. However, our understanding of the relationship between calories, energy, and weight is fundamentally flawed as a society, and misinformation is promulgated by both the internet and health professionals alike. This section explores the relationship between calories, energy, and weight in detail, and attempts to answer the question, how many calories should I eat? Review of the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics states that in a closed system, energy cannot be created or destroyed, also referred to as the law of conservation of energy. This law can be applied to nutrition via the following equation. Caloric intake minus energy expenditure equals change in total energy of the body. This equation must be true by definition. Energy must be accounted for on both sides of the equation. It simply cannot be created or destroyed. However, an incomplete understanding of this equation leads to conceptual ideas about nutrition that are not accurate. Myth number 1. The first law of thermodynamics argues for the calories in, calories out theory. The calories in, calories out, or psychotheory, essentially postulates that because of the first law of thermodynamics, the way to lose weight is to go down on the amount of calories one intakes and or exercise more. Or stated another way, if I'm not losing weight, then by definition, I must be eating too many calories. While at first this makes sense intellectually, anyone who has spent any time pursuing weight loss, either for themselves or clinically with patients, can tell you that it simply does not work for the majority of people in the long term. The formula of caloric restriction plus increased exercise works in the very beginning for the highly motivated and compliant individual, but check in with them again in a year and you're likely to find all the weight loss has returned. A meta-analysis done in 2007 that looked at studies with caloric-restricted weight loss for which there was at least a 2 to 5 year follow-up, the results were clear that in all studies, a large proportion of the weight is regained. So the question then becomes, why does CICO not work? 2 possibilities immediately arise. The first possibility is that CICO does work theoretically. However, people generally do not have the willpower to see it through in the long term. The consequences of this can be devastating psychologically for the patient who accepts this as truth, for it shows a weakness of character. If only I was a stronger person, I could commit to weight loss with more discipline. The second possibility is that the CICO theory is wrong, or at least an oversimplification of a complex idea. Perhaps the interpretation of the first law as it applies to nutrition is incomplete and needs further refining. We argue for the latter. The CICO theory is wrong. You cannot simply lose weight in the long term through caloric restrictions and increased exercise. This seems to be evident from our experience, even in people who are 100% compliant, and from the preponderance of the medical literature. Myth number 2. The first law of thermodynamics is irrelevant. Calories do not matter. Rejection of the CICO theory perhaps then leads us to the other extreme, the idea that calories do not matter at all. This idea is prevalent in the nutrition world. It postulates that because the CICO theory does not work, it actually does not really matter how many calories you consume as long as these calories are healthy. The problem here is that firstly, it seems to contradict the first law of thermodynamics, which we previously defined as being axiomatically true. And secondly, taken to its extreme, this idea seems to break down. For example, if one were to consume 10,000 calories per day, even if that food were healthy, is one to say that a person would not gain weight? This logical fallacy is often mitigated by the argument that if the food is healthy, then the body's natural hunger, satiety mechanisms will intuitively tell the person exactly how much to eat. The problem with the counter-argument is how we define what is healthy. In many situations, healthy is essentially code for low calorie. For many people, the definition of what it means to eat healthy is to essentially eat salad all day. If that is the case, then yes, it does not matter how much you eat because no matter how much salad you eat, the calories are always going to come out low. Thus, in some situations, the calories do not matter hypothesis is actually just another way to get to the CICO theory using different language. Truth. Calories do matter, but it's complicated. In order to understand why calories matter, we need to dive more deeply into the application of the first law of thermodynamics and also relate this to the dynamic nature of human biochemistry. Let us review the equation. Calorie intake minus energy expenditure equals change in total energy of the body. Remember, the term change in total energy of the body essentially is a proxy for change in weight. Let us dive a little deeper into the energy expenditure section. The body's energy expenditure is equal to the resting metabolic rate plus general activity plus exercise. The resting metabolic rate of the body is essentially the rate at which calories are burned into energy for physiological functions. Even at rest, we need to burn calories to keep our heart pumping, our lungs breathing, our kidneys filtering, etc. We will discuss metabolism in more detail in future sections. However, for now, we simply need to understand that metabolism is the internal rate by which we burn calories into energy. It is certainly true that if the calories are too high, the patient will gain weight. However, what is also true is that if calories are too low, the metabolic rate will go down. When people cut calories, in the short term they will lose weight. People that subscribe to the CICO theory believe that cutting calories should lead to a linear weight loss through time until the patient essentially stops cutting calories. However, what actually happens is the patient initially loses weight linearly, but over time the rate of weight loss declines until the patient reaches a new equilibrium in where they are not losing weight at all, even with the caloric restrictions. This chart shows the phenomenon graphically. People generally believe that if calories are cut and exercise remains constant, then weight loss should continue at essentially the same rate until the patient returns to a normal amount of calories. However, what will actually happen is that in the medium term, the velocity of weight loss will decrease until the patient reaches a new equilibrium and will eventually maintain a weight at a reduced caloric intake. This is accounted for by a decrease in the metabolic rate. The reason why this happens is because if the calories are too low for too long, the metabolic rate goes down. Let's look at an example in more detail. Carlos is 250 pounds and consumes 2,500 calories per day. He would like to lose weight, so he decides to drop his caloric intake to 1,500 calories per day. In the beginning, he's in a 1,000-calorie deficit, and he is losing 2 pounds per week. As time goes on, however, the weight loss velocity goes down. A couple of months go by. Now he's losing 1 pound per week, then a half a pound per week, and then all of a sudden he's eating 1,500 calories per day and maintaining his weight. At the beginning, Carlos was maintaining his weight at 2,500 calories, and now he's maintaining his weight at 1,500 calories. If a person is maintaining their weight, then the change in total energy, aka caloric deficit, is 0. Thus, the following equation is true. If the patient is to maintain his weight, caloric intake equals energy expenditure. If activity and exercise is constant, then this phenomenon is explained by a decrease in the metabolic rate. This is vitally important not only for weight loss, but also for health in general. Decreased metabolic rate is a core functional imbalance, ultimately leading to a multitude of issues such as poor energy, brain fog, constipation, immune system dysfunction, hormone imbalance, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, and many more. The amount of calories we eat matters. If we consume too many calories, we will gain weight, and that is clearly not good. However, if we consume too little calories, we will induce metabolic dysfunction. Evidence and biological plausibility that caloric restriction cause a decreased metabolic rate. The idea that caloric restriction causes a decrease in the metabolic rate is well accepted in the medical literature. Studies show that CR causes a decrease in free T3 and an increase in reverse T3. Resting metabolic rate, measured by indirect calorimetry, is also shown to decrease during caloric restriction. The idea that the organism would decrease the metabolic rate in the context of caloric restriction makes sense when looked at from the perspective of evolutionary biology. The organism does not understand the idea of caloric restriction to purposefully lose weight. Instead, the organism perceives caloric restrictions as starvation. For millions of years, human beings evolved in the context of starvation. It was likely highly beneficial in the long term for an organism to decrease the metabolic rate during periods of starvation because it allows the organism to hold on to calories, or in other words, use stored calories more slowly. Early humans who were better at this would likely live longer during periods of starvation. A decrease in the metabolic rate also causes changes in the stress-anti-stress hormone balance, which allows the organism to shunt energy away from things that are non-essential to spare essential biological functions. A starving organism will first see a decline in function in processes such as advanced cognition. We don't need to be able to be doing calculus when we're starving. Gastrointestinal function. We don't need a lot of digestive power when we are starving. Reproductive function. We don't reproduce when we are starving. Immunological function, non-essential for survival. And hair, skin, nail health. We do not need beautiful hair and flawless skin when we are starving. Rejection of the theory that caloric deficiency is a contributor to functional imbalances. It is worth discussing at this point that if one is presented with the idea that they are under-consuming calories, they will initially reject it. This happens for essentially two reasons. First, many patients will say, if I'm not consuming enough calories, then why am I not a stick figure? Imagine speaking with a patient who is overweight and telling them that they do not eat enough calories. The thought of this at first glance is absurd. People believe intrinsically that their weight is directly proportional to how much they eat. If I'm a normal weight, then that must mean I eat a normal amount of calories, and if I'm overweight, I must be eating too many calories. It is the calories in, calories out theory in another form. But as previously discussed, this is simply not true. Some of our most overweight patients consume 700 to 800 calories per day. It is more complicated than people think because they're not taking into account the metabolic adaptation to a calorie-deficient diet. Secondly, the patient might reject the hypothesis because they do not feel that they are under-eating. They might say something like, I eat 3 meals a day. I fill up my plate, I feel satisfied and full when I'm done, and I just can't imagine eating more food when my stomach is full. This idea is also flawed for a few reasons. First, the volume of food may not be the same thing as total calories. Imagine for a meal, one were to consume a gigantic bowl of kale. At the end of this meal, this person would probably feel full. The volume of food would fill the stomach. But 2 hours later, this person would not feel good because there is very little calories in a bowl of kale. Also, people who have a digestive dysfunction may have a decreased appetite. For example, a patient with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, will produce a lot of gas in the upper intestinal system, which will often significantly reduce appetite. Lastly, some people likely condition their stomach to consume less food. The stomach and intestines may get used to consuming a low amount of food and over time reduce acid output, reduce digestive enzyme output, and reduce motility. But suffice to say, a person's weight and their fullness may not be good indicators of their caloric intake. A note about popular nutrition claims saying caloric restriction is healthy. A variety of popular or fad nutrition sources claim that caloric restriction is healthy. These claims are backed by the citation of studies that show the apparent improvement in certain health biomarkers, including reduction of blood pressure, reduction of cholesterol, decrease in inflammatory factors, and insulin resistance. One thing we must remember, however, is that sometimes labs and biomarkers go in the right direction for the wrong reason. In particular, fuel markers such as cholesterol, blood sugar, and fasting insulin may go down in the context of starvation. Take a patient with type 2 diabetes with significantly elevated blood sugars. If you were to aggressively starve this patient for 2 weeks, the patient's blood sugar will go down simply by the starvation effect. no sugar coming into the system. However, this is the wrong strategy. The idea is not simply to have blood sugar go down, but to have blood sugar effectively transported into the cell and into the metabolic machinery for energy production. This is the right way to get blood sugar down. The same can be said about cholesterol. This will be discussed in detail in later sections. The starved diabetic may see better blood sugar, but they will see an overall worsening of their labs, lower CO2, lower thyroid levels, adrenal overutilization, anti-stress hormone depletion. When a patient goes into caloric restriction or starvation mode, the metabolic rate goes down. However, in order to compensate, stress hormone, i.e. cortisol, adrenaline, go up. There are some good things about this physiologically. Firstly, we feel good about a lot of adrenaline running through our system. Imagine you decide to go skydiving. You jump out of the plane, open the parachute, and land safely on the ground. How do you feel? Amazing. You feel invigorated, energized, focused, and alive. The problem is you don't want to live like this. Being on an adrenaline rush all the time is anxiety-provoking. The system is not meant to run on adrenaline. It is meant to run on thyroid-driven, calorie-driven energy metabolism. Eventually, the system will crash if it constantly runs on adrenaline. Also, cortisol itself is anti-inflammatory. Think about a cortisone injection into an arthritic joint. Thus, it is certainly possible that caloric restriction would cause a decrease in inflammatory markers such as CRP via an increase in cortisol. We live in a society that is highly encouraged to be skinny. Not only do many people feel being skinny is attractive, but also that it is healthy. Perhaps this is simply because skinny is the opposite of being obese, and being obese is clearly bad. Marketing agencies are also quite effective in the terms of portraying and defining what sexy is to the detriment of how real, well-adjusted, metabolically healthy people look. This type of good and bad thinking often leads us down an erroneous path. Obesity is bad, therefore skinny is good. If obesity is bad and we are to believe that obesity is caused by excessive calories, then logically calories are bad. Taken to its extreme, perhaps some even believe that food is bad. While not said out loud, this type of thinking pervades society. Popular fad nutrition culture plays into this. Most diets basically boil down to, how can I trick my body into being satisfied on a calorie-restricted diet? It does not make sense biologically that health would be aligned with weight reduction. Your biochemistry does not care if you have a six-pack or not. In fact, from a survival perspective, it would actually make more sense that the organism with a 10% body fat percentage would have less biological success or fitness than one with 25% body fat. The former has no reserve. If that organism gets sick, is stressed, or goes for a prolonged period of starvation, he is much more likely to die. Weight is one parameter of health, but it is not the final goal and should not be thought of as good or bad. It is better to be a metabolically healthy obese person than a stressed, malnourished, skinny person. A quick note about short-term fasting. Please note that this section discusses the effect of long-term caloric restriction on health. It does not apply to short-term fasting. In nutrition culture and the medical literature, fasting refers to a small amount of time, perhaps 3 to 5 days or possibly up to a few weeks, in which the patient is consuming almost zero food, or at least a dramatically low amount of total food. Our position on short-term fasting is neutral. We generally do not recommend fasting due to the theoretical risk of decreased metabolism. However, we do recognize that there are potential benefits to fasting. The benefits of short-term fasting are likely due to the following factors. 1. Reduction in endotoxin LPS levels. 2. Reduction in polyunsaturated fatty acid PUFA stores. 3. Reduction in the amino acids methionine, cysteine, and tryptophan. A full discussion of these benefits is beyond the scope of this chapter. While it's not unreasonable to pursue a short-term fast if a patient wants, there may be better strategies to achieve these ends without the need to induce starvation and the pro-stress anti-metabolic signals that accompany it. Summary. Continuous non-cyclical caloric restriction is ineffective for weight loss in the long term. Eating the correct amount of calories is important for optimization of physiology and health. If the patient consumes too many calories, the patient will gain weight. If the patient consumes too little calories, the patient will suffer from metabolic dysfunction. Convincing a patient that they are consuming too few calories can be challenging, as it may run counterintuitive to how they currently believe the body works. In this situation, objective dietary analysis is essential. If there is an underlying gastrointestinal dysfunction that causes a low caloric intake, this must be addressed concurrently.